Hello, this is Lupin. In this tutorial, I will be demonstrating how to import some models from Mixamo.com into Unreal Engine 4. We will start off with the third-person template in the Unreal Engine. As you probably know, in this template we have the Unreal Engine robot, which we can move around, jump around, and do the third-person stuff. What we're going to do is to change this model and use another one that we get from Mixamo. Of course, the first thing to do is to sign up at mixamo.com and create your username and password. Once you're logged in, you simply go to the homepage at www.mixamo.com, and then on the top left, choose the characters button to see a list of the models available, and then pick one that we like. For this tutorial, I will be using the model that's called Vampire. You can simply search by name using the search field on top left. Once you find the character that you like, you just click on it and then confirm this is the model that you want. And the 3D model will be automatically shown in the viewport on the right. The second step is to choose the animations that we would like to use. For this, we just use the link on the top left which says animations. We can again use the search field to look for any animations that we would like to use. The first animation I need is an idle animation, which we will use when the character is not moving. So I simply type in idle in the search box. I will be using the second idle animation. Whenever I pick an animation, Mixamo will start playing this animation on the 3D model in the viewport, so we can immediately see what it looks like. I quickly check if the animation looks fine, which seems to be the case. So now I'm ready to download. So just use the download button on the top, which will bring up the download options. For Unreal Engine, the default values are okay. So I simply press the download button again. Mixamo will simply pack the files in FBX format. We just have to wait a couple seconds and then just save these files in a folder that we can locate later. I will name this file Vampire, which is the model's name, -idle, which is the animation's name. In addition to the idle animation, I would like to have a walking animation. So I will search for walking in the animations. I will use this kind of drunk walking animation. It seems to be an interesting animation, so I will use that. I'll just go over the animation and check if there are any flaws, which seems to be okay. The only thing I have to change in these settings is to use the in place option. This option makes the character not move during the animation. And the reason is that we are going to add the movement of the character within Unreal Engine. Once I've chosen in place, I simply hit download, leave the default options again, and hit download once more. Waiting a couple of seconds until the files are ready. Just like the idle animation, I will rename this file as vampire-walking. Since we now have both animations that we're going to be using, we're basically done with Mixamo. So I will just close that window and go back to Unreal Engine. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I will be using the third-person template as my beginning point. So in the Unreal Engine launcher, I am creating a new project, which will be blueprint based. I will select the third-person template and then choose a location and a name for the project, and then simply hit create. Once my project is done creating, we will have the standard third-person template running. Next step is to import the FBX files that we just got from Mixamo into Unreal Engine. I will create a new folder in the content browser. I will simply name this as Vampire. Double click on the new folder and hit import. I will start with the idle animation. So I simply choose vampire-idle.fbx. And now I'm presented with the Unreal import options. There are some important options here. The first one is that the skeletal mesh option should be enabled. Import mesh should also be enabled since this is the first time we are importing this model. I can leave the skeleton option as none, so it will be imported from the FBX file. Since I will not be using any physics for this project, I will simply deselect Create Physics Asset. I will make sure that the animations are being imported under the Animations section. And I can leave all other options at their default values and simply hit Import to start the importing process. I can safely ignore these warnings that I get. Once the import is complete, we will have several files in the content browser. The first one is the skeletal mesh that is marked in blue. Mixamo by default creates two animation files. The first one, animtake001, is the one that I'm not going to be using, so I will simply delete it. Third file we have is the skeleton asset itself. The red files are the textures, and the remaining green files are the Unreal Engine materials that are applied to the model. The first thing I'd like to do after the import is to check the model by simply dragging the skeletal mesh asset into the world. And as you can see, we have some major problems with the model. The model seems to be completely transparent. What causes this problem is the Unreal Engine materials, which sometimes have wrong default values when imported from Mixamo. So to fix this problem, we simply have to edit the Unreal Engine material. I simply double click on the material file that was created during the import and maximize this window. In this window, on the left hand side, we have the material properties, and the one that's causing this problem is the one called blend mode, which is currently set at translucent. I simply set the blend mode to opaque, which effectively removes any transparent areas from the model. Another thing that we will have to fix is the two-sided option. But before changing this option, let's go ahead and see what the problem is. So I hit apply to save the changes and go back to the main window. Now we can see that the problem with the transparency is gone, but we still have some areas where the material is only visible from one side. And we can see that especially in the character's hood and the tassels on the swords. As I mentioned before, to fix this problem, we just have to change another material property, which is the one-sided property, which is just below the blend mode. So I simply enable the two-sided property and hit apply to save the changes and close the material window. After the shaders finish compiling, we will hopefully see that our model looks as it should. This means that we have now successfully imported our model. So I will just remove the static mesh in the world. And before doing anything else, I will now import the second animation that we downloaded. Just like with the idle animation, I simply use the import button. and then find the file that we named vampire-walking. Double click on it to import. For importing the second animation, we will have to make some small changes to the import options. First of all, we leave this skeletal mesh as it is because we are still dealing with a skeletal mesh. But since now we already have the mesh in the Unreal Engine, I simply deselect import mesh. I just have to make sure that I am reusing the skeleton asset that was created when we imported the idle animation, so that we do not end up with two separate skeleton assets. Since we are not importing any meshes, most of the options are now disabled, and the rest of the options I can just leave at their default values and simply hit import. After this import, we will just have two new animation files, one of which is the take anim001, which I will not use, so I will just delete. So now we have the walking animation imported into Unreal Engine as well. Now we will swap the model on the player controlled character with the model we just imported. I simply select the player character, which is blueprint based. So in order to edit the blueprint, I just choose Edit Blueprint on the top right and choose Open Blueprint Editor. And now we have the third person character blueprint. I really do not want to change anything in the event graph at this moment, so I simply select the Viewport tab. I select the mesh from the left hand side, and in the properties dialog on the right, I will simply change the skeletal mesh from its default value of SK mannequin to the skeletal mesh asset that we just imported, the vampire. Now let's compile the blueprint, go back to the main editor window and hit play. Now I see that we can actually control our character, but no animations are played at the moment. We can move, we can climb stairs, we can even jump, but our animations are not working. Now we will fix this by creating our own animation blueprint for this character. Our animation blueprint will help us switch between different animations. For this tutorial, I will build a very simple animation blueprint, which will play the idle animation whenever the character is not moving at all, and walking animation when we have some movement. To create our animation blueprint, I will just hit Add New in the Content browser, and under the Animation section, I will choose the Animation Blueprint. We can leave the parent class as blank, but for target animation, we need to select the vampire idle skeleton that was created during the import. I will name this animation as BP_vampire animation. Now I will open the blueprint by double clicking on the file. Basically, this blueprint will figure out under which conditions which animations will be played back. First thing to do is to create a variable which we will use in the blueprint. I simply hit Add Variable. I will name my variable character velocity and assign float as the variable type. What we're going to do is, during the update event of our blueprint animation, we will use the pawn velocity and then assign the current velocity to our variable. In order to do that, I will just use the try get pawn node and then pull an execution pin out of there and search for get velocity. The get velocity node returns the velocity of the pawn in a vector form. In order to turn this into a single float value, I will use the get vector length node. Now I would like to assign the return value of get vector length into my variable. I simply drag the variable into my blueprint and select set, since this is a set operation. And I will connect the execution pin from the update event to my set node, and also connect the getVectorLength value to the variable. This makes sure that my character velocity variable will be updated at every frame of the animation. The next step is to create a state machine in the animation graph. So I simply open up the Anim Graph tab, right click on the blueprint and search for Add New State Machine. And I will connect the resulting animation that comes out of the state machine into the final pose of the animation graph. I will rename my state machine just for the convenience. I will rename it run/idle. I double click on the state machine to edit. Every state machine starts from a default entry point and then decides on which state we should currently be on. For this state machine we are going to have two states. To create the first state, I just drag an arrow from the entry, choose add state, and rename the state as idle. The second state will come out of the idle state, so I just drag an arrow out of it. Again, select add state and rename the state as walking. To edit the idle state, I double click on it. Whenever the idle state is active, I will simply play the idle animation. To do that, I right click on the blueprint and search for Vampire Idle Animation. And then connect this to the output. I will go back to the state machine by clicking on the state machine name from the top. I will start editing the walking state by double clicking on it. Again, just like for the idle state, I right click on the blueprint, search for Vampire Walking Animation, and then connect the animation figures together. Now we have both the walking and idle states complete. The only thing that's missing is the transition between these states. In order to create our transition rules, I simply click on the transition icon, which is these two small arrows. Now I have to define under which conditions we will move from the idle state to the walking state. This condition is based on the character velocity variable that we created before. So I drag this variable onto my blueprint and choose get, since I'm only reading this value. I need to compare the current velocity with a set value. So I just drag from the value. I use the bigger than sign and assign a very small value to compare. I use 0.5 just to give a small buffer and connect the output boolean into the result. What we're doing here is simply checking if the character is moving, and if so, we start playing the walking animation. We need a similar condition for going back from the walking animation to the idle animation. To create this transition, I just simply drag an arrow from walking to the idle state, and again double click on the arrows to edit the condition. The blueprint here is very similar to the first transition. I just read the character velocity variable by using get and compare this value to 0 by using the smaller or equal node. Now I can connect the output to the result, and now whenever the character velocity is 0 again, we will go back to playing the idle animation. Now I can compile, and our animation blueprint is complete. One last thing to do is to make sure that our animation blueprint is being used by our character. So I open up the character blueprint once again. In the main editor window, I choose the character and hit edit blueprint. Let's open up the viewport once again. Choose the character's mesh component. On the right hand side we have under animation mode, so I select use animation blueprint, and under animation blueprint class I select the animation blueprint that we just created. So I search for BP underscore vampire animation. As soon as I have my blueprint set up, you will notice that the character is now playing the idle animation. Now we can go back to our main editor window, hit play and test our character. So whenever I'm not moving my character, the idle animation is successfully playing. But when I start moving my character, we can see that our character is moving around drunkenly and everything seems to be working at this point. So we reached our goal for this tutorial. We now have our own character in the game, which we can control, whose animations are working. So thanks for watching. Leave any comments below and have a good one.